So this is Initially Yours. It's number 50 in the One Stitch at a Time monthly embroidery club. And this one is a monogram pattern. So it comes with the complete alphabet, so you can choose which letter you'd like. And when you print out your design, this is how it prints out without the letter. That's something I added on. So you also get the page of letters, and you get them both in the original fashion and in reverse, so depending on how you want to trace it. So I just went ahead and picked a B and cut that out, and then put a little tape on the back, and I've taped it in the middle. Now, since it has a little bit of a shadow, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell exactly if it's in the right spot. And one thing I like to do is squint my eyes, and then it will make that shadow kind of disappear, and I can really see if I have it in the right spot. So if you're just going to trace, you want to use just the original orientation, so everything's facing the correct way. And you need a light box or a window. I love my light box. This is by Portatrace. It's very thin. See how thin it is? But it was an investment, but I use it all the time, so for me it was well worth it. I like that this is smooth, so there's no lip at all. So if I'm tracing something bigger, it's not going to get in my way. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to put our fabric, and this is the Moda Crackle, over our design, and I would probably tape the fabric to the pattern just so they stay together. I'm not going to do that right now, but that's probably what I would recommend. And then I like to trace with the Pilot friction pin, which disappears with the heat of an iron. I just ordered these, and they're a little bit different than the previous ones. I have to say I really like it, and I do have these on my website. So I just start by scratching a little bit in the corner to get it going, and then I start tracing my design. Now, as you can see, the fabric is kind of wiggling around, so you really have to keep an eye on the fabric because it wants to move. So what I would recommend instead is when you print out this pattern, print it out on a piece of freezer paper. And that way you can actually iron the wax side of the freezer paper to the back of your fabric. And now they're stuck together, and it makes the fabric stabilize. See, now the fabric doesn't wiggle around on me. Okay, so I actually had a program on my computer so I could just pop the initial on there. So it's not taped, but that's fine. You could print that on regular paper and then tape it on. Now, if you're using the freezer paper method, make sure you use the reverse image. Okay, so check that out. It's all stuck together. Nothing's moving around, and when I go to trace it, the fabric doesn't wiggle around. See how much easier that is? I still do kind of a little sketchy line just because I like it a little darker. Actually, I'm tracing this one from my mom, bless her heart, because she is also stitching up these monthly samplers. And since I've already traced it twice, why not 3 times? Because it goes really fast when you have the freezer paper on the back. Okay, so there you can see how fast that went, and I have that much done. So that's my tip on tracing the design. Also, I wanted to point out on the letters, when you're tracing those, it isn't necessary to trace all of the chain stitches. I would just trace the outside stem line. This is going to be a stem stitch. And then we know when it comes time to stitch, that chain stitch is just going to run right alongside that stem stitch. You'll do the stem stitch first. If you want, you can do the dots, or you can just eyeball it. Those are going to be French knots. And then this is going to be a fern stitch up the middle. And the end of the fern stitch is, since it's a little longer, that's going to be a back stitch. And this is all on the printed directions that come with your monthly pattern. What I've done is I've traced some of the designs on just a piece of fabric so I can show you the stitches on here. So what you'll need is a needle, and if you haven't seen this, this is a little needle case that you can make. It's a free download on my website. It's a piece, you just print out the paper, and then there's instructions on how to take an empty toilet paper tube and wrap it, flatten it, and you can make a little handy dandy needle case. So got my needle. I like to use a size 7, and some of this will be repeated, but if you haven't seen this before, I'll just go over it again. So I'm using 6 strands and I only want 2. So what I do is I kind of tap the end, and that makes the little ends individualized so I can see them. And you're going to pull one at a time while you're pinching, and then another one. And by separating the strands, that keeps the thread from twisting as much while you're stitching. And by pinching it and pulling, your thread doesn't get all tangled up. Okay, so I'm going to start with the closed fly stitch, which is what I used on the leaves. And if you've done a fly stitch, it's the same thing. You're just doing it really close together, and they're kind of, instead of being, you know, a sharp V, it's a little flat, more flat. So what you want to do is you want to start at the tip of the leaf, and you're going to just take a first stitch that's maybe 1/8 of an inch. We just need a little point at the top of the leaf. Now you're going to bring your needle up on one side on the drawn line. You're going to carry your thread down, put the needle on the other side of that initial stitch and on the line, and you're going to bring it up at the base of that first stitch, that 1/8 of an inch stitch. The thread is going to go under the needle, and there's your first stitch. Now, we're not going to take a long stitch. We're just going to come right down on the other side of that. That's one stitch to hold it in place. And then we're going to come up, just like we did before, on the line, right next to the previous stitch. Carry the thread under, come down on the other side of the leaf, and back up at the base of that previous stitch. The thread is under the needle, and now I'm just going to tack that fly stitch in place. And then you just continue down until you get that all filled in. And it leaves it with a really nice little kind of center vein, which I really liked. And I know I was doing a lot of fishbone stitch, but I think this one might be my new favorite because it's easier, I think. And that center line is really, really visible. So we're just going to continue all the way down. And you don't want to pull it too tight because that can kind of gather the fabric. So you want to leave some tension, or not as much tension on it. And one thing that might help is, if you find yourself pulling it too tight, is to do this in a hoop. That will help prevent that. If you feel more comfortable stitching with a hoop, by all means do that. Isn't that coming along nicely? And you can see that center vein kind of. I really like that stitch. Okay, I'll finish this. The other way you could do this leaf, if you don't feel like doing that much stitching on there, like if you're filling this in, if you're using a black thread or something, maybe that's just a little too dark. So on that one, what I would do, like here's the stem. So I'm going to stem stitch, which I'll go over in a little bit too, but so I've stem stitched up to my leaf, and I'm just going to, I want to turn this corner So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back down in the same hole at the end, come up on one side of the leaf, just like 1/8 of an inch, go back again in that same hole where I went down, come up halfway in between, and I want the thread to actually be on the top of that leaf, because whenever you're doing a stem stitch, you want the thread to follow the curve. So since the curve is going up, I want my thread to be on the up side. And now that's how I've turned that little corner. And you can do that for sharp corners too. And then I'm just going to take maybe a 1/16. I like to take smaller stitches on curves. So the tighter the curve, the smaller the stitch. And technically, all your stitches should be the same length. But I don't have a type A personality, so I don't really care. Okay, so we've come to the end. Now, what I like to do for the leaf, instead, I can do that same type of turn, or I'm just going to take maybe 3 little threads past that last stitch and come up. See how tiny that is? Now I'm going to turn my fabric, and I'm going to come down the other side. I missed it a little bit, but that's okay. And what that does is it just creates a really nice little point at the top of the leaf. And again, I'm carrying my thread on the same side as the curve. So on the outside in this case. Now for the center, I could do a number of things. I could just do a stem stitch up the center. I could do a little running stitch. That would be cute. Or I could do a fly stitch. So I think I'm just going to do a little running stitch. And this is another good reason to use the Pilot Friction pen, is if I'm doing a running stitch and I've drawn that line, I don't want that line there after I press it. And when you press these, when you apply heat to this ink, it disappears. So then you won't see the drawn line. All you'll see are the little running stitches. So that's one variation on how you can do that leaf. Going back to this closed fly stitch, I wanted to show you using a lighter colored thread. You don't notice the background fabric as much if your stitches aren't right next to each other. But if you're using a darker thread, like I did on this version, then like on some of these dark ones, you can really see that fabric underneath. If you have a colored Sharpie, I would just color it in before you stitch over it. Or the other thing that I ended up doing on a few of these leaves is I just went back and took a stitch to hide that fabric. So you can see on the lighter ones, you don't notice it as much, but on the darker ones, you tend to notice it a little bit more. So, and this one I did using Cosmo Floss colors, and I don't know if you participated, but I did have a little contest. Not contest, I just said leave me a comment on our Facebook group page and on Instagram with your initial, and then I pick one and I do that initial, and I'm going to actually mail this one to Kat. Her last name starts with an M, so this one is going to her. And all these colorways, these colors that I used of Cosmo are listed on the pattern printout that I give you on the monthly program. So the other way that I stitched it is with this Valdani thread that is a variegated, well, it's not variegated, it's a twisted thread. So it kind of has a, reminds me of like a tweed look. Isn't that kind of pretty? I thought that was really nice. So the only other thing I did a little bit differently between these two is with the nest. So when I used the Cosmo, I also added some little seed stitches in there, where I didn't on this one. And also, as you can see, you know, a lot of times these designs, they're not directional, so it doesn't matter which way you trace it. There really isn't a backwards way. This way the bird's facing to the left and this way is facing to the right, and it works both ways. The little eggs in the nest are satin stitched, and you can see, you know, some of the shapes are a little wonky, but that's okay. And one thing I have found, instead of going directly horizontally or vertically on an oval like this, I find it a little bit easier to go at a diagonal to get it filled in, so the ends aren't too pointy, if that makes sense. So, for instance, on this egg, I'll show you. The other option too is if you have a blue Sharpie or a permanent color pen, like a Pigma pen that's blue, you could color that in first, and that way if your stitches aren't right next to each other, the fabric won't show. So what I like to do is start at the top, and then I'm going to basically follow this line down, and then bring my needle right next to where I started. And the thing you want to do with a satin stitch is just take your time. I think that's the trick. And don't pull too tight. Again, this might be a stitch that you'd like to use a hoop on to keep it from pulling the tension too tight. If you don't want to do a satin stitch, you could always just outline this. It's a little too small for a stem stitch, so I'd probably use a back stitch. But I think it really makes a statement when they're filled in nice like that. So there we have a little egg. And because I didn't pull it too tight, it actually has a bit of dimension to it. You can see it's kind of sits up on top of the fabric a little bit more. So it almost looks like an egg. All the dots on this piece are French knots. So I wrap these with 3 strands. So you pull your needle up right on the dot. I'm going to wrap the needle around, or the thread around the needle 3 times, and put the tip of the needle really close to where I started. I pull this thread so it's taut but not tight, and slip those wraps down to the fabric. Now with my finger on the back and my thumb on the front, I'm holding that nice and taut. I pulled it a little too tight. Let me start again. I couldn't pull my needle through. Taut, not tight. Just slip it down, hold that in place, pull the needle needle through, and you have a pretty little knot. Since these are fairly close together, I just carry my thread. If I have to travel too far on the back, I'll go ahead and tie a knot. Okay, I'll do this again. 1, 2, 3. I kind of use my finger to hold it there. Pull the wraps down to the fabric, pinch that in place, and pull the needle through. And some people prefer the colonial knot. This is a little bit harder to show, but what you do is you're going to have your needle and your thread parallel to each other, excuse me, and you're going to cross your needle over, wrap it underneath, and then you're going to take the thread that you're holding on to in the other hand and wrap it the other way across the top of the needle. Now on your needle you have a little figure 8. Then you put the tip down really close, pull that down, hold it in place just like you did before, and you have another knot. So you can kind of see the difference between the knots. I made a little smaller of a knot. I kind of like my French knots better because I like that little dot in the center, but some people will only do a colonial. I'll do another one for you. Parallel, across, wrap it under, wrap the thread around the top of the needle, and really close. You have a little figure 8 on your needle, pull that down, and that's a colonial knot. So on the monogram, what my instructions say are to just trace the outline. It's not necessary to trace the chain stitch up the center. You can do that, but it really isn't necessary to do that. So to stem stitch, we always want to start at an end. You don't want to start like in the middle of the letter. You always want to start at an end. And since this is a straight line, I could have my thread on the top or the bottom. And I'm going to take about an 1/8, come back halfway in between. And that's my first stitch. Now I'm going to go a 1/16 and come up in that same hole. I'm going to make this one bigger just so you can see a little better. I'll do an 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to come up in that same hole. So by same hole, I mean where this thread went down, right there. And you just continue all the way up. Now when we're doing the stem stitch around the top part of the bee, I will be carrying my thread the same direction as the curve. So I'll finish up the stem stitch and then I'll show you how to do the middle part. So besides the stem stitch on the letters, we also have the chain stitch that runs right up alongside. So I finished on this one all the stem stitching, and then I did some of the chain stitching. And I wanted to show you the difference too. The reason why I did a stem stitch first, so here's just a chain stitch on its own, and the edge of it is a little bumpily, and I wanted a really nice smooth edge on the letters. So that's why I chose, plus I just like the chunkiness of those 2 stitches right next to each other. So for a chain stitch, you're going to start at the bottom, and that's the other thing I wanted to point out. Since they are a bit directional, I started at the bottom and worked up, the bottom and worked up, the bottom and worked up on all the letters. So we're going to make a little loop with our thread. It's going to go up and around. The needle goes right back in that same hole where we started. I come up about an 1/8 of an inch. My thread's going to go under my needle. You want to pull the thread towards the loop, not back this way, or it will close up. And there's the first chain. You're going to take the needle inside that loop, about an 1/8 of an inch, and see I'm going right next to that stem stitch. The thread goes under the needle, and there's the second one. So when you get to the last one, you're actually going to take the needle down on the other side of the loop to tack it in place. So when I tie a knot, I've shown this before, but I'll repeat myself. I just wrap it around the needle a couple of times, pull that down to the fabric, put my finger on it and pull. Now I have a knot. Now I'm going to repeat myself, only I'm just going to leave about 1/4 of an inch between the base knot and the next knot, and snip it, and now I'm ready to go. My thread is all knotted. Okay, so the next part I'm going to start in the middle with these dots and then work my way down and work my way up. So as you can see on this side and this side, I did 2 different kinds of knots. This is the French knot, this is the colonial knot. French knot sits a little bit higher. These sit nice and close to the fabric. So it's a matter of preference, whatever you'd like. So I'm going to do, I think, the colonial knot on these. So let's see if I can zoom in just a little bit. There we go. So parallel, wrap it around, wrap the thread around the tip, hold it in place with my finger, take the needle down, and there's the first one. Once you get it down, it goes really fast. At first it seems a little complicated, but it's really actually pretty easy. Okay, so now we have the 3 French knots, and we're going to move on to the Fern stitch. So we want to start at the top. The first stitch is just going to go straight down the center to where the V intersects, come up on one side of the V, go back down in that center hole, and on the other side of the V, back down in the center hole. Now I'm going to jump down to where that V, the next V intersects, go up, make that center stitch. So it's just basically a bunch of single stitches. And then once I get to the base, I want this to go down a little bit longer, and I didn't want to do a stem stitch necessarily, so I'm going to do a back stitch. So I'm taking about 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to go back to that center of the last V that we did, go down another 1/8 of an inch on the other side of the needle, or where the thread came up, go back to the base of the previous stitch, and repeat that. So I'm going on the other side of the needle, back in the hole, and now I have that side done. Now I'll just go and finish this top little portion. And as you can see, because I don't use a hoop, it is a little bit puckery, but once I press it, then it lays nice and flat. And when I press it upside down, and that way the stitches can actually kind of get absorbed into the cushion of the pressing surface, so that it doesn't flatten the stitches necessarily, it just flattens the fabric. So I think that's all the stitches in this one. I hope you enjoy this one and find something to do with your little monogram design. Maybe you can stitch it up for a friend, and we'll see you next month.